So it was important for us to give examples from around the world, not to focus on any one country specifically. And there are great examples of people doing great things on sustainability in all regions, and we wanted the book to really reflect that.
Hello and welcome to Book Club with the Italian Wine Podcast. I'm your host, Richard Hough, and I'm delighted that you're joining us as we get between the vines with some of the best wine writing out there. So sit back, pour yourself a glass, and enjoy the show with the Italian Wine Podcast.
This month, our guest is Jane Masters, co-author along with Andrew Neither of Rooted in Change, the stories behind sustainable wine, published by the Académie du Vin Library on the 1st of October 2025. Hi Jane, welcome to the show.
Thank you, it's great to be here.
Thank you very much for agreeing to come on the Italian Wine Podcast, and a massive congratulations on your new book. I'm very much looking forward to exploring the big themes around sustainability that your book explores, and hearing your views on how the wine industry and wine consumers can respond to the great challenges of our era.
Yeah, and there are some big challenges.
No pressure. Just a planet to save, that's all.
Exactly, yes.
So before we get to those matters, tell us first a bit about your background in wine. When did your interest in wine begin?
Gosh, well, my interest in wine began a long time ago, probably as a student, really, and started, like many people do, I guess, just as a student job working in the local wine bar. And all through university, I carried on sort of working in bars and restaurants just to earn a little bit of money on the side. And then I guess once I finished university, I did a degree, first of all, in biological chemistry. But actually, it was one of my professors at uni who told me all about oenology, which is the art and science of wine. And I got more and more interested and went off to France, where I ended up doing a degree in winemaking, and the rest is history. It's been a long time now, my whole career.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and that combination, I suppose, of working in hospitality at university, but then also that academic interest as well, and the science behind winemaking. I think I was on the other side of the bar during my university days, so I was never quite struck by wine in the same way.
Yeah.
And so how then did that transition into a career? You went to France. And that presumably is working in winemaking rather than in wine
Yes,
writing.
Initially. Well, I first went to France. I actually went to work for a number of months in what they call in France a stage, to do a stage. And I ended up in Cognac. So I was actually a few months in there working in the QC and the laboratory. And Cognac is not very far really from Bordeaux, which is obviously one of the premium wine regions of the world. And during that time, I went down. I met some people who were studying oenology at the time. They took me down to the institute to visit it, and next thing I knew is I signed up as to do a postgraduate diploma. So I did that for a few years, and then made wine, and then went back to the UK to work for a big retailer as part of their buying department. And I've done various things since then. So it's been a really interesting career, lots of different things, always great people, great wines, lots of things going on.
Yeah, and you became a Master of Wine in 1997.
Yes, so I did my Master of Wine. I was at the time I was working for Marks and Spencer, which is a UK retailer. I did my Master of Wine whilst I was there, and that was really interesting. And I'm still a Master of Wine. I'm still not as active in the institute as I used to be. At one point, I was on council and which is part of the managing body, if you like, and chair of the institute. But always lots of really interesting and knowledgeable people. The world of the institute just opens up the whole world of wine to you. So that was a really interesting thing to do.
And aside, obviously, from writing this book, what does your current day-to-day job in wine involve, Jane?
So I'm currently working for Majestic Wine Group, which is a group in the UK. We have Majestic Wine as a retailer. Many people will know we have about 215 shops in the UK, but we also have on-trade businesses, Majestic Commercial and Inotria. And we recently purchased, about 18 months ago, a range of wine bars, Vagabond. So it's quite it's an ambitious group. It's got lots of different facets to it, and I'm getting involved. I'm part of the buying team for Majestic Retail, but getting involved in working across the buying teams and all the different parts of the company, which is, again, fascinating.
And presumably this is an extremely busy period for the organisation at the moment, coming into Christmas.
Oh yeah, Christmas is by far, for any drinks retailer or any drinks business, I should say, an extremely important part of the year. It's really your make or break for the whole of the financial year, really. Lots of people obviously going out celebrating, people buying wines to enjoy with their family and friends at Christmas, over New Year. So yeah, really, really busy right now.
And how would you evaluate the state of the UK wine retail market at the moment, just in kind of broad general terms? We're hearing that this is always a moment of crisis for the wine industry, with fewer young people drinking. And then,
Yeah, I mean it's a really, really challenging time in the UK, but not just in the UK. I would say it's challenging because wine consumption in virtually every key market around the world has been dropping, and in the UK, we've seen that in the last few years, and that has only been exacerbated by things like there's a lot of pressure on prices. So the UK government has increased the duty rates on wine fairly substantially in the last 18 months or so, and we're just waiting for the next budget to come through, and the expectation is that that will go up again. So it's a very challenging time. I mean, it's a difficult one because I think there's never been a time where there are so many great, good wines out there available for consumers. So it's great for consumers to find and discover new things, but very, very challenging for producers and retailers to make it all work, given the challenges from the government.
But to end this part of the conversation on a more positive note, what are some of those wines that you're helping customers from Majestic Wine discover and find? What kind of wines are emerging or exciting the UK market at the moment?
I mean, the UK has always been a shop window on the world of wine. It's, until relatively recently, it didn't really produce much wine of its own at all. Obviously, that's changed in the last decade or so, but even so, the UK wine production is very, very small. But it's always been a reflection of wines from all around the world. So, we are still, at Majestic Wine, we're still very strong in European wine. We sell a lot of Italian, French, Spanish, but equally we have wines from all around the world: Australia, Chile, South Africa, and they all, I would say, in every country you've got people working really well, offering wines at below £10, which are just really drinkable, good value, I would say everyday wines. And then we've got people, again, in all around the world, smaller family owned estates that are making reasonably priced wines, and then right up to the sort of super premium wines that sell for very high prices. And I would say that at each of those levels, the value and the quality is great.
Excellent. And final question then, just to bring this part to a close. What will be on your table this Christmas? What would you be drinking on Christmas Day?
Oh, well, I always have to have a glass of champagne because I do love champagne. We actually sell a champagne called Bilkar Salmon, which is one of my favourites. So that will certainly be opening up on Christmas Day. And then, I just so many. My husband's favourite grape variety is Viognier, so we'll probably have as a stock sort of white wine to keep us going in between the formal moments. some Viognier, probably from south of France. And then for some of the special sort of Christmas Day or New Year's Day, sort of more special meal times, I have to say, having spent 5 years and studied and trained in Bordeaux, we'll probably have some mature Bordeaux open, and maybe a bottle of Burgundy as well. So
Sounds good.
sorry, I'm missing out Italy completely, which I probably shouldn't be doing on your podcast, should I? But
You'll have the chance to redeem yourself later in the show. Don't worry. Okay, so I mean you're very much involved then in the retail commercial side of wine, but this project, this book that you're involved in with Andrew, what inspired you to write that book, and what inspired you to write it together with Andrew, and what was that process of co-writing like in practice?
yeah, so what inspired me to write the book? I guess anyone that's been involved in wine, whether it's as a consumer or as someone in the trade, knows just how important climate and weather is to wine. It's really what determines whether you can grow Vitis vinifera, the vine that is responsible for most wine grapes that are produced around the world. And then the weather from one year to the next determines the amount of grapes, the quality of grapes that are produced, and the style of wines that can be made. And I guess my interest stemmed from there initially, seeing and hearing so much about climate change. It started with a desire to want to understand actually what was happening in terms of climate change and the impact that that was having on vineyards, and starting to think about what does that mean for us as a trade? What should we be doing to counter some of that, and to try and, prevent climate change from getting worse than it ultimately has to be. So that was my sort of starting point, and I guess it had been a number of years that I'd just been interested in looking and trying to understand. And as I looked more and more at climate change and understood that actually climate change on its own is part of environmental sustainability, if you like, but that links in very much with social sustainability, economic sustainability. They're all interdependent. You can't have one without the other, or what you do in one aspect will have a knock-on impact in other areas. And so I started becoming more and more involved in understanding sustainability and what we should do as a trade, and felt that there just wasn't a place, a book where you could understand all the interactions between these different aspects. So I thought there was something for my own brain to try and pull all of that together. And I started pulling all of that together. And then, to be honest, I was introduced to Andy by our publisher, Hermione Ireland. We didn't know each other before. Andy is a trained journalist, so comes from a completely different background to me, had written about wine, but had also written and been involved in corporate communications in completely non-wine things as well. And Hermione sort of said, well, would you be interested in doing a book together? And that's really how it all started. So we met, we had lunch together on a Saturday afternoon, and just talked about our different views on things and how we like to work, and and at the end of it we found that we had pretty similar views. We both quite challenging, want to understand things, want to challenge how things are done. We had complementary skills or experience, and so we decided that we'd give it a go. So we started writing the book together. I'd already done a bit of the outline of the book and put together my thoughts. As I said, I'd been interested for a while. So Andy took a lot of that stuff, read through it all, sort of helped identify the gaps and the bits that we needed to get a bit more research, get a bit more up-to-date information in. He also spent a lot of time at the beginning of this year, end of last year, beginning of this year, travelling around to various vineyards and interviewing people directly, and we just touched base. Every week or so we had a call and we'd run through, and in between we were swapping bits that we'd written. and trying to put it all together. And I think we were just lucky.
Yeah.
I don't know. All came together nicely.
Brilliant, excellent. And I mean, one thing I wanted to ask about, I was going to ask later, was about the research, because it struck me when I was reading this book that you do take case studies or explore what's happening all over the world, from Chile to France to South Africa, Australia.
Yeah.
So I was wondering the extent to which that was boots on the ground. You were there speaking to the owners, and it sounds like Andrew was doing some of that.
Oh yeah. So it was quite important for us both to give a holistic view of sustainability, to make sure that we covered all the aspects of sustainability in climate, environment, social and economic sustainability, equally that we covered the whole world of wine, and also that we went across the whole value chain, if you like. So from what happens in the vineyard through to how wines are made, through to how they're packaged, what they're packaged with, how they get from the producing region to the end consumer, indeed what happens post-consumption. So and we wanted also to make sure that it reflects the world of wine. Wine is made in many, many countries around the world. 50% of the wine that's produced each year is exported outside of its country of production. And therefore, we wanted to make sure that, giving this holistic view, we captured all of that. So it was important for us to give examples from around the world, not to focus on any one country specifically. And there are great examples of people doing great things on sustainability in all regions. And we wanted the book to really reflect that. And to be able to give some context to, there's lots of challenge. There's lots of challenges. But there are lots of solutions that people are developing. We don't have the answer to all of it, and there is no one size fits all solution. We have to be clear about that. But we did want to give this holistic overview.
Yeah, I mean, it really does reflect that sense of being on the ground. Most chapters, most passages in the book, from my recollection, begin either in a vineyard or in a recycling plant or in a bottling plant or something like that. So there is really a sense that it is grounded, although it's in some ways it's quite a technical book in its approach to some quite incredibly complex subjects. It's always rooted, as the book's title suggests, rooted in what's actually happening on the ground. So that's something that I was really struck by in reading the book.
It was quite a challenge, really, because we also wanted to make it accessible, so easy to understand, easy to read and easy to understand. But it is a complicated subject, and we needed to try and find the right balance between explaining some of the technical and science stuff behind it to make sure that all made sense. So hopefully we achieved that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Do you want to give us a reading,
yes,
Jane, from the book, just to give our listeners a sense of?
Yes, I will start. So I'll start with a couple of bits that I've picked from the first chapter. So this starts with, our climate is changing already. In 2024, France's National Research Institute for Agriculture, INRA, published a study of how climate change is altering wine-growing regions. It showed that if global warming exceeds plus 2 degrees centigrade, then 90% of coastal and low-altitude regions in southern Europe and California may no longer be able to produce good wine in economically sustainable conditions by the end of the century. And in November 2024, the International Organization of Vine and Wine, the OIV, pointed to climatic challenges across both northern and southern hemispheres as being major contributors to the plummeting levels of wine production in 2024, the lowest global since 1961. Climate change presents a serious and immediate threat to the enjoyment of millions of wine drinkers around the world, and to the livelihoods of many thousands of wine growers, workers, and businesses. Some observers have predicted that it could call wine's very viability into question in places as widespread as Catalonia, Bordeaux, Chile, and Australia. But sustainability is about more than climate change. Climate change is the greatest challenge, but there are others too. Our planet's complex interactions between land, forests, soil, oceans, air, and living organisms have kept its climate relatively stable over thousands of years. But we have now reached a point where Earth's natural self-regulating systems can no longer cope, not just with the quantity of greenhouse gases we are emitting, but with our waste and pollution too. Sustainable wines are those that not only taste good, but are also good for the people who make them and good for the planet too. A sustainable global wine trade should aim for net zero carbon emissions, minimal packaging and waste, and have positive social and economic impact. But while how grapes are grown and how wines are made and packaged are decisions taken by wine companies, consumers are part of the solution too, which if you're reading this book probably includes you.
Excellent. Yeah, and that really does capture the stark consequences, if you like, of climate change, but also offers or points towards what the solutions might be in terms of sustainable wines and consumer choices. To drill into the issue of climate change, you describe it in the book as the canary in the coal mine. And I think for anyone involved in the wine industry, it seems to me they are completely aware of climate change and the impact that it's having, but that isn't necessarily true of the wider population. So, what more can the wine industry do, I suppose, or what is the wine industry doing to confront the challenges of climate change?
Well, first of all, I think the canary in the coal mine phrase really relates to the fact that unlike certain crops, so a lot of cereal crops, for example, can be grown under all sorts of different climatic conditions, whereas there are other crops, vines being one of them or grapes being one of them, along with coffee, that really can only grow in quite narrow climatic conditions. And that is because the growth cycle of the vine is determined very, very clearly by the average temperatures, both day and nighttime temperatures. And there are things during the vine cycle where it is particularly prone to or susceptible to things like spring frosts, heavy rains. And so even if we park the impact of climate change, where we talk about very, very extreme weather conditions hitting, so, torrential rains, periods of drought, very high heat spikes, even without all of that, just these slowly increasing average temperatures affect how the vine grows and the quality of the grapes that it produces. And that's really where the canary in the coal mine phrase comes from, I guess, because we see it very clearly. The grapes, the harvest each year is becoming more erratic in terms of size of harvest. We're getting grapes being harvested at much higher sugar levels and low acidity levels because of the warmth. And all of that has an impact on the flavour and the style of wines that can be produced. And so what a lot of grape growers are doing is looking at how they can mitigate some of the impacts, how they can make their vineyards more resilient, how they can make them more resilient to long periods of drought. Many European vineyards, for example, don't have the right to irrigate. So in the New World, often vines have been established in regions that had access to large amounts of water, which could be used for irrigation. That was quite often not the case in Europe. And we also know that the agrochemicals that were used in conventional farming, which were developed sort of post-Second World War, which, now we understand the unintended consequences of some of those use over time, which is a loss of soil fertility, which then impacts further the soil's ability to retain water, it loses carbon, so it becomes a vicious cycle. So what we're trying to do as a grape grower in terms of becoming more sustainable is to build resilience in the vineyard and create a virtuous circle where we're capturing carbon, we're keeping it in the soil, we're developing biodiversity. You know, vineyards, I don't know whether all of your listeners will know, but vineyards live for decades, so they can create they're part of an ecosystem with diversity of life around it, and much of which we see above ground, but there's an enormous amount of life in the soil, whether it's insects and worms, but mainly bacteria, fungus. They all contribute to actually creating a biodiverse ecosystem which is much more resilient.
Yeah, that's something that I'd like to come back to, on the soil and biodiversity. But just on the question of climate change, isn't it the case that wines or vines have always had to evolve to changing climatic conditions? And hasn't the wine industry or wine producing in general always faced these kind of crises, whether it's war or revolution or plague or prohibition or disease or pest? What makes the current moment so, or the current threat so serious?
Well, I think you're right. There have always been big threats that have challenged the wine trade. The biggest one probably ever was phylloxera back in. But yes, wars, prohibition, all of these things have had an impact. I guess the biggest difference here is that we are talking about something that is not just relating to wine. It's much bigger than that. It affects all crops. We happen to be the canary in the coal mine, but it is affecting all sorts of agriculture. It's also affecting people, populations, communities, the whole planet, actually. So I guess that's where the size and scale of the challenge is. And let's be honest, the wine trade can do so much. And I think it has in its power the opportunity to do quite a bit, as I say, because it's got vineyards that can build in resilience, create biodiversity. But even doing all of these things, it on its own cannot solve the planet's problems, but it can actually be used as an example to encourage, to inspire, to look at and to prove, to demonstrate what can be done, and perhaps give people the incentive to reflect on their other industries and what can be done to make it more sustainable for all of us going forward.
Okay. And again, we'll come back to some of those specific measures that consumers and the industry more generally can do. But I wanted to ask about, you mentioned all crops there being vulnerable to climate change, but is there something about Vitis vinifera that makes it particularly vulnerable to climate change? And are there varieties that are particularly exposed, or on the other hand, varieties that are more naturally resistant?
So I mean, as I think I mentioned earlier, Vitis vinifera grows in a fairly narrow sort of range of climatic conditions. So Vitis vinifera then is made up of a series of hundreds of different grape varieties within that. And you're right, some have a much greater tolerance or a much wider range of climate conditions that they can thrive under. They may produce wines with different flavours and grapes, but Chardonnay, for example, is found probably in every single wine region around the world. It will grow in cool climates, it will grow in warm climates. It's got a fairly wide tolerance. Other varieties like Pinot Noir, or even if you stick to white grape varieties, Sauvignon Blanc, tend to have much narrower criteria to produce the best grapes, and in a world where temperatures are increasing and we're having these big heat spikes at 40, 45, 47, nearly 50 degrees centigrade in some cases in some vineyards, even those varieties that are tolerant to that heat will suffer. But certainly the varieties that prefer cooler climates and need water. Again, each variety has its own tolerance to drought or water requirements. And the difficulty is that as climate change increases, your heat spikes increase. At the same time, the amount of water available because of the drought conditions goes down at a time when the plant actually needs more water, not less. So it's being sort of hammered, if you like, on both counts. And basically the vines just shut down. And during the season, if that happens for a period of time, it's not too serious. It will affect that year's crop, but the vine will come back to life, hopefully the following year. But there are examples, and South Africa is a case in point. If you remember, there was a serious sort of three-year long drought in South Africa up to, I think, 2014 to 18, something like that, where the old vines, which had survived the first couple of years, these are vines that have been planted for best part of 100 years, survived the first 2 years of drought, but the third one was they just couldn't manage, couldn't take it anymore, and a lot of them died. In Chile, there's been a long period of drought as well, and whereas in some of these new world countries, people used to think that it was absolutely, the best place ever to grow grapes because you had clear blue skies, lots of sunshine, limited pressure from sort of fungal diseases, mildew, etc., and what seemed like an infinite amount of water to irrigate with. So, Chile and Argentina, Mendoza, both used to use snow meltwater from the Andes that came down, used to use what we called flood irrigation. Water was no problem. They literally used to drench the vineyards in water in the winter so that the soils were saturated. But that's no longer the case. Their rainfall has dropped. Even the snow in winter on the Andes has dropped. Water is much less of a given, and there are certainly regions in both those countries where people are sort of seriously having to uproot and say, we just can't make this work anymore. We need water and we don't have it.
Yeah, I was particularly struck by the impact on Chile as a wine region. Reading your book, it seemed to be an example that you came back to time and time again, just to illustrate the impact of climate change in that region. And that was spelled out recently in the OIV report just the other day on global wine production, where volumes of wine production in Chile have really been decimated in recent years.
Chile's always had a relatively low rainfall, but in Curacao, for example, the average rainfall, 10-15 years ago was 750 millimetres. It's now down at 450. In very dry years in 2020, it was down at 150 millimetres. Up in the north, in Limerick, the rainfall has dropped from an average of 150 to 40 millimetres. So it's serious, and this is why we say it is ultimately it's an existential threat to growing grapes and to making wine.
But not if you live in England.
No, there are some regions like England that to date have benefited from warmer average temperatures. That's true, and England has a thriving producing winemaking trade at the moment, mainly sparkling wines. But even so, climate change still presents itself in terms of these very extreme or erratic weather conditions. So even in the UK, you can have summers with lots of drought. We can irrigate here, but there is again the same pressure on water resources and infrastructure. But then you can have these late spring frosts, violent storms during harvest, and those are equally a challenge to winemakers as the general sort of drought conditions.
Before we come to look at some of the solutions, another threat to the wine industry at the moment that you explore in the book is the use of pesticides.
Yeah.
What are the consequences resulting from the use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides on soil and the wider biodiversity, and what are the more ethical or more sustainable alternatives?
Yeah, so agrochemicals really, I guess we didn't realize until, well, some people realized a while ago, but it's become much more commonly accepted that the use of agrochemicals generally does deplete the natural biodiversity in soils. So any chemical that you're applying, and the thing about grapes is or vines, they are susceptible to things like mildew, which is a fungal disease, and they've always been treated. Part of the vine grower's role is to prevent disease in the vineyard, obviously, to get the best quality grapes. But using synthetically produced chemicals, which when they were developed, we really felt they were very efficient, that they targeted pests effectively. But we now know that all of these chemicals actually kill the bacteria and the fungi in the soil. They kill, as well as the target pest, if you like, all the other or many other life forms around it, which ultimately affects biodiversity, which ultimately affects the amount of carbon that's captured in the soil, the fertility of the soil. It becomes this vicious cycle where the soils are degraded, and the more degraded they become, the more the vine actually needs to find its nutrients. So it becomes this sort of diminishing returns because you have to add more chemicals to get the same result. So the idea is that we need to sort of break away from and the other thing about agrochemicals is that we haven't talked very much about greenhouse gas emissions, but obviously if you're talking about sustainability, we're talking about trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, reducing carbon footprint, and in the vineyard quite a large amount of that carbon footprint comes from the production or manufacture of agrochemicals, as well as their transport to the vineyard, as well as then the spraying by tractors, the use of diesel in the vineyard to apply them. And so by moving away from or minimizing the amount of chemicals that we use and using lower quantities in much more targeted ways and encouraging biodiversity to re-establish itself, we create this virtuous circle where the fertilization of the plants is no longer through chemicals, it's through cover crops that have been sown, it's through the use of animals in vineyards to act as, natural herbicides, if you like. So instead of spraying a herbicide, you've got sheep that wander around and eat some of the other plants and things, naturally fertilize as they go. So you create a different sort of system, and it's really it's actually about returning to what people used to do in the past before all these chemicals were available. So you asked about the different techniques available,
and you mentioned cover crops.
Yeah, cover crops, but moving towards organic farming, biodynamic farming, which is similar in many aspects, or regenerative farming. So organic farming avoids the use of these chemicals, synthetically produced chemical applications. It does use chemicals, but they mainly natural based, so based on copper or sulfur. Again, though, if they are used for over very, very long periods of time or in abundance, they too will have a negative impact. So the idea is, as you go towards organic, you reduce the amount. You're very targeted as to when you spray, you monitor your vineyards, you do it really only as and when it's necessary. And the whole idea is that you create this natural ecosystem that becomes the nutrients from the cover crops that you sow. As they degrade, they fertilize the soils themselves rather than having to apply external chemicals to do that. Biodynamics is similar. except that it's uses slightly different preparations. A lot of it is about composting. It also is about following phases of the moon, applying treatments and composts at certain times of the month. And again, it's about creating a vibrant, biodiverse sort of ecosystem within the vineyard that is self-sustaining. And regenerative viticulture, or regenerative farming, which is probably the thing that everyone is talking about right now, is, it takes both of those approaches, but its main difference is that it applies a no-till approach. So if you think about a conventionally farmed vineyard, and I'm sure many of your listeners have been to vineyards, many of them in the past you'll have seen pristine rows of vines with nothing on the soil between the rows or between the vines. Everything was either sprayed with herbicide and or ploughed so that all the vegetation was taken away. Regenerative farming, now there are cover crops, but instead of cutting the cover crops and ploughing them back into the ground, they're simply mown and flattened down so that they form a sort of carpet, if you like, across the soil that protects it from erosion, helps retain water. It helps build up the carbon in the soil and encourage, again, greater biodiversity. So all of those three methods are the direction of travel if you want to become more sustainable. And I should say that many conventional practices of conventional viticulture are applying organic, biodynamic or regenerative farming techniques, but not actually going that final step to convert, because they do want to have the flexibility of being able to use a spray if needed.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask. I wanted to get your sense as to whether producers were adopting these kind of approaches themselves in response to the climate emergency, or whether it might be something that the market would insist on as consumers become more engaged with these issues, or is it something that's going to require regulation or a stronger form of intervention? What's your sense there, Jane?
I think there's definitely more and more growers moving towards organic and biodynamic and regenerative, but it's still relatively small. I mean, 90% of vineyards are still farmed conventionally using conventional chemicals. But as I say, even within that, there are many people that are learning and applying the principles behind organic and biodynamic farming without becoming certified in that direction.
Yeah.
And I should also say it's much easier to do in some regions than others. So obviously it depends on the climate that you're working in. Many regions, as I think I mentioned before, one of the biggest aspects for grape growers is controlling fungal disease, so things like mildew, which tend to be more, there's much more fungal disease pressure in regions that have quite a high humidity. So for example, just taking France as an example, it's much easier to farm organically or biodynamically in Provence than it is in Bordeaux, because Bordeaux has a much more humid climate. It's much closer to the Atlantic Ocean, and it brings its sort of it has a natural sort of high humidity level, which means disease pressure is higher. Having said that, even in those regions, which I would say 20 years ago people would have said it's impossible to organically farm in Bordeaux, there are a lot of people that have transitioned across. But equally, in some years that are difficult, we've seen that some people have struggled with maintaining that organic approach. They've had to face some quite serious, decisions about, do I stick with organic and lose my whole crop for this year, or do I continue to work organically as much as I can, but when the situation becomes so difficult, do I actually need to have the flexibility to apply some chemicals? So they're not always easy or clear-cut decisions.
Yeah, that's very clear. I was struck by the number of wineries, case studies, or positive, innovative wineries who are embracing some of these techniques. Very many of them seem to me, anyway, to be in the southern hemisphere in South Africa or New Zealand or Chile or Argentina and also California as well. Is that because they are the most innovative or the most exposed to climate change?
Um,
Or have I
no,
misunderstood that?
I think the difference with the New World is that generally there is less bureaucracy and
Mm,
generally there is a openness to look at how things can be done differently. But I would say that everywhere in European regions as well, there is a desire to address these challenges. I guess the other thing about New World is that a lot of the regions are relatively recently established. They're not the hundreds and hundreds of years old that we have in Europe. And quite often they were established in regions where there was lots of sun, very little disease pressure because there was no rain, but they depended heavily on irrigation. And at the time, that all made sense. The thing that's changed now is that many of those regions still don't have any rain. The water resource, though, is becoming scarcer and scarcer, and the temperatures are increasing in all of those, and they already tended to be in warmer climates, I would say, or hotter climates than take parts of Australia. You would never have planted something in Europe in under the same conditions. So I
mm,
guess that's what's driving some of that desire and real sort of at the forefront of trying to find ways around this, how to minimize the amount of water that we use it efficiently, effectively, A, because it's becoming scarcer, and B, because it's becoming scarcer, it's becoming more expensive to use. And I think people can ultimately see that at the end of the day, irrigation, the water is finite, and that's got to be used for human consumption. It's got to be used to grow other crops,
mm.
foodstuffs, and wine wine growing has not necessarily always going to have the same amount available to it as it has in the past.
Yeah. And switching to the role of consumers as wine drinkers, what can we do to encourage a shift towards more sustainably produced wines? Should we be more receptive to the idea of non-glass packaging, for example, alternative forms of packaging? Is that something we can do to help?
Yeah, for sure. So we haven't really talked too much about carbon footprint, but
No.
the thing about packaging, and you touch on it here, is that the packaging and distribution of wine accounts for over 50% of its carbon footprint. And essentially, a lot of that is driven through the fact that much wine is packaged in glass bottles. Glass is energy intensive to produce, and therefore it has a high carbon footprint itself. It's quite heavy, which means if you're transporting it both empty and then filled bottles of wine, it's using quite a lot of fuel to do that. So again, it's adding to that carbon footprint. But glass is a known and trusted uh, material for wine. It keeps wine
Yeah.
fresh. It allows it to mature. And so I don't want to denigrate it too much, but what we should be doing is actually looking at the weight of glass that we use, because the lighter the bottle, and this is probably where I would criticise some Italian regions and
Mhm.
probably also some South American countries who often put wine in very, very heavy bottles, and whether a wine bottle can range from 300 grams up to over a kilo. I mean, I've seen bottles that weigh 1.2 kilos empty, which is crazy. And so if you think about just the carbon footprint in producing those two different bottles, one has 3 times the amount of greenhouse gas emissions associated with it than the other. And technically, it makes absolutely no difference to the way in which the wine evolves in the bottle. So certainly we should be looking at, as consumers, not buying wines in really heavy glass bottles. But glass is really the only alternative. If you've got wines that are being made to be drunk or are being drunk sort of 12, 18 months after the vintage, then glass really is the only alternative. On the other hand, if you've got wines, and a lot of wine is purchased and drunk very quickly, then looking at things like aluminium cans, bag-in-box, there's rPET bottles, they are all alternatives that I think we should be open to reduce our carbon footprint. But at the same time, as I said before, there's no silver bullet. So they each have their advantages and disadvantages. Bag-in-box has a much lower carbon footprint, but the bag inside the carton that you see is generally a multi-layered sort of metallized plastic, which really, aside from one or two consumer regions around the world, it's really not recyclable or recycled anywhere. So it's more sustainable from a carbon footprint point of view, but not from a waste and landfill point of view. rPET, there are some really interesting recycled PET bottles being used. One produced by Pacamama, which is a flat-shaped bottle, which not only do you gain in terms of the weight of the bottle, so they're also, because they're flat, they pack into boxes much more efficiently, so you use space well, you can transport more in a container. So you're gaining all the time in terms of sustainability from that point of view. And as long as that rPET bottle goes into a plastic recycling scheme where it is collected and recycled again, that's better from a sustainability point of view. However, they tend to be they are sealed using an aluminium screw cap, which I would say is not as sustainable as a cork. So, cork stoppers are natural, or produced from a natural material, I should say. Cork forests, the majority of which are in Portugal, each cork oak can live for about 200 years. The forests themselves create natural habitat and encourage biodiversity. They actually act as a carbon store themselves. So the carbon footprint of a cork stopper is negative. So it actually acts as a sink, so it can offset some of your other greenhouse gas emissions in that way. Whereas aluminium screw caps, we all think of aluminium, and indeed some wine is packed into aluminium cans. We all think of aluminium as being strong from a sustainability point of view, which I would argue, okay, yes, it's recyclable and much of it is recycled. However, the demand for aluminium all around the world is constantly growing, and that's essentially, due to things like not just the drinks industry, but it's used in cars and aeroplane manufacture, and so the demand is there, which means that raw materials have to be mined. Bauxite is very, very dirty. It's produces all sorts of environmental issues as it's mined, and then as it's transformed from bauxite into what we call primary aluminium, uses a huge amount of energy to produce it. And so it has its own downsides too. And then on top of that, if you think about the aluminium screw cap on the top of the bottle, because they're so small, they don't tend to be recycled in the way that cans are. They tend to fall through at the sort of recycling sorting plants and generally don't get recycled. So I would say not very sustainable. So as consumers, just coming back to your question then, what should we be doing? I think you're asking the right questions. I think we should definitely be avoiding anything that's bottled in a very heavyweight bottle. I would, if we want wines that are, that have a little bit of age on them, then look for something in a fairly lightweight glass bottle sealed with a cork. If we're looking at wines for everyday drinking, just simple wines that are going to be drunk relatively young, then by all means, I think look at bag-in-box and the PET bottles, but with a reminder that that doesn't necessarily fulfill the recycling aspect of sustainability. But there are definitely things that we can all do. And then, of course, looking at the producers and how they farm, looking for organic, biodynamic, regeneratively farming, following those producers and encouraging them to do more. I think the more that people ask questions, look for these wines, and I know my local wine shop here in London told me the other day that he's constantly getting younger people coming in asking for more and more organic and sustainably produced wines. So it's definitely happening. And I think as a trade, we've got to make sure that we fulfil that requirement for consumers. All consumers, every consumer survey that I've read in the last 10, 15 years says that people are concerned about climate, they're concerned about sustainability, they want to be able to lead a more sustainable life, they want to have choices. And I think as a wine trade, we need to listen to that and to make sure that we're giving them those options and giving them an understanding of, of the choices that are there.
Yeah. I mean, I think as your answer alludes to, it's not always an obvious or easy choice as well. It can be a massively complex. There's a range of factors, that you've mentioned: carbon footprint, waste, climatic change, and wider sustainability. And I mean, we've really just scratched the surface of those issues. The book itself really goes into fantastic detail on all those things, looking at the waste cycle and looking at packaging in detail, looking at bottling plants and things like that. So the book really is highly recommended if you want to take a deep dive into any of those industries and really tease out the complexity there. One thing that I do occasionally, not as often as I probably should, but perhaps also too often, is use vino sfuso shops here in Italy, which are basically like petrol stations for wine. You just go with a glass bottle or a plastic container of some kind, and you can just fill up the wine and you pay by the litre. So it's extremely cheap. You can also do it with beer now. There's a few shops now doing that with beer. You obviously have to drink the stuff within a couple of days, so it's important to get your quantities right. As I've discovered a couple of times when I've arrived on a Sunday night with 4 litres of wine left to drink before the end of the weekend. But in terms of sustainability, it strikes me that kind of option is a good one, and it's very, very common here in Italy.
It's definitely common, and there have been all sorts of people looking at how we could implement similar things in different places, or indeed use things like refillable bottles, but it does become quite difficult because refillable bottles is slightly different to what you're describing, but and there is a company here though in London who supplies into restaurants, so they bring the wine over into the UK. They have a little bottling plant here in London. They bottle it into refillable bottles. They send them out in crates to their restaurants. As they deliver the new ones, they pick up the empties, they take them back, they wash them and sterilize them and then refill them. And, and that works. But you can't do that on a large scale in a retail environment because everyone's got different bottle shapes. You have to have space to store the bottles. Glass is fragile, it chips. So you've got to make sure that it's kept okay, and you're not sort of damaging it in any way. But all of these things are avenues that we're still, as a trade, exploring. And definitely the opportunity to take your own container and to go and get it filled up is just a great idea. Very traditional in Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the pleasures of living in a place like Verona. That these little enoteca or these little wine shops are on every street corner, more or less. So you can just go with your
Yeah,
plastic container and pay a couple of euros for a litre of pretty decent, quaffable wine made extremely locally. And um, yeah, it's a good sustainable way of buying wine, especially if you cycle home with 6 litres of wine in your rucksack. Then I can highly recommend that. I'm conscious of time, Jane, but I want to touch also on the issue of social sustainability. That's something that the book addresses as well. It's another massive issue, but in a few words, what do we mean by social sustainability, and how well is the wine industry meeting its obligations in terms of how it treats its workers, in terms of their welfare, their conditions, and their
yeah.
pay?
Well, social sustainability, you just touched on it.
Mm.
I mean, it's anything to do with people, really. So yes, it's workers, employees, but it's also, I would say, our customers, people who drink wine. So I guess one of the biggest challenges in mainly wine producing regions is the issue of migrant grape pickers.
Yeah.
So it's not unique to grapes. I mean, we see it in other agricultural industries, but there have been instances, and in many different regions around the world, and you might think that it's all going to be related to poorer regions, but no, there have been incidents of migrant workers, for example, in Champagne, being
Mm. Yeah.
paid very, very little, and not being, housing
Yeah.
and accommodation being pretty bad. And so that,
Sorry to interrupt you, Jane. The Guardian has been very diligent in exposing these kind of issues
yeah,
over the years.
yeah, and it's serious, and it still happens. It happens in the wine trade as
Mm.
well. I would also say, though, that that's in wine producing areas, but also in urban areas where a lot of wine is sold, in hospitality, in retail. People work long hours. It's not always the most highly paid job to work in hospitality
Yeah,
or
yeah,
in shops. So there are all sorts of factors involved in social sustainability. Equally, as I say, I think customers is an important one. We are selling alcohol, and we must be aware of some of our social responsibility in selling wine, and make sure that we are doing it appropriately, and that we recognise that if people have a problem with alcohol, or even if they don't have an ongoing problem with alcohol, but it can cause accidents, drink and driving. There's all sorts of other issues. So we need to be selling responsibly, marketing responsibly, looking after our workers, and then there's the whole aspect of diversity and inclusion. When I joined the wine trade a long, long time ago, you would go into a sort of tasting in central London, and and even still now in some of the traditional sort of stuffier tastings, you could go in and you would sometimes just be the only female in the room.
yeah.
That has changed, but there is still a lot to go and to do. And I think as a trade, we need to make sure that we've got opportunities for everyone, that we're encouraging and developing people's skills, that we are creating diverse professional cadre of people, so that that will help address all these challenges that we've been talking about. We need people in vineyards with skill and expertise. It is more complicated than many other agricultural industries. Pruning grapes is a whole art in itself. We need people who understand and know about wine, but equally who can communicate and talk to customers in the right way, rather than sort of download a whole load of technical information, which is what we've tended to do in the past about, well, I suppose I talk about it a lot about how grapes are grown and how the wine is made and all of that. But we need to make sure that the way in which we're talking about wine actually appeals to consumers, because at the end of the day, if we don't have consumers that want, are willing and are able and can afford to pay for wine, then we're not going to have a sustainable wine trade either. So all of these things are important.
Absolutely. And what about from the consumer's perspective? What can they do to ensure that the wine they're drinking has been ethically produced? Is there a label or something we can look out for on a bottle of wine, or is it just about knowing the provenance of the wine that's in front of you?
Yeah, I think in most places you would like to think that labour laws and there is protection in place. And really, when you come across some of these malpractices, it is people that have knowingly broken the rules and regulations, and basically abused the staff that they have. How you sort of counter that on a label, I'm not sure, because it comes back to just buying wines from reputable companies, asking questions about how and where the wines are produced, looking at their, you can gain a lot just from looking at people's websites. I know that a label on a bottle of wine is not going to tell you always the whole story, but in Europe they have the QR codes now where you can see a bit more information. I think just getting to know the wines and the producers that make them, where they come from, should give you more confidence. And then, of course, the retailers, I think, bring their own credibility with them in that, buying teams are going out, visiting wineries, they do their own audits, they may request that producers are signed up to things like the BRC in the UK. So there are audit processes that should protect and give consumers that confidence.
It's perhaps unfair to ask you this, but is that something that, as a buyer with Majestic, that you're conscious of when you're looking at new producers? Are you exploring their ethical footprint?
Yeah, I think we're doing more and more of that, and looking at sustainability from all aspects. So we have a very clear path that we want to become more sustainable. We are looking at packaging as being, because it's the major contributor to carbon footprint, then obviously working with producers to actually reduce bottle weights, but make sure that the bottle still looks attractive and has appeal. Because as I say, if you do something to the bottle that makes it so that people don't want to buy it, there's no point. So we've got to find the right sort of sweet spot where we move in the right direction and bring customers with us. So we're looking at packaging. We're certainly out. We know all our suppliers. We visit them. We don't visit physically everybody every single year because there's just so many. But we have a rota. We always go to the wineries. We meet the producers. They come over to us as well. And we ask questions about, what is their strategy? What is the evidence that they're doing things, how they're doing things? And having spent many, many years visiting people, you can pick up very, very quickly whether you believe what you're being told.
Again, perhaps a little bit unfair, put you on the spot like this, but would you reject a bottle of wine, for example, that you are considering if considered that the bottle was too heavy?
Yeah, I think we're getting to that point, definitely.
Okay, I'm conscious of time, so I think that's maybe a good place to wrap up the conversation. Where can we follow you? Where can we get a copy of the book?
Right, so the book is available on Amazon all around the world. In the UK, it's in Waterstones and Daunt Books and some selected Majestic wine stores. So it should be hopefully pretty easy to find. To find me, that's a little bit more complicated. I don't have a website right now, but I'm posting quite a bit on LinkedIn. So you can find me on LinkedIn, and I've done quite a few posts in the last 6 weeks or so since the book came out with various bits of information. I've also, in the last few years, been moderating a series of sustainability wine webinars for the Institute of Masters of Wine. So if you go onto the Institute of Masters of Wine website into events, you can find the recordings of those as well.
Fantastic. We'll put links to all those organisations in the show notes. Jane, thank you very much once again for being my guest today on Book Club. And once again, a massive congratulations on a really, really important and comprehensive contribution to the question of sustainability and how it impacts the wine sector globally.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Great. And next time we can try and get Andrew on as well, but I know it's a busy time for you both.
Yeah, no, I'm sure he'd be delighted.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, and thanks for listening to the Italian Wine Podcast. Ciao.
Ciao.
Thanks for joining us on Book Club with the Italian Wine Podcast. Tune in again next month when we'll get between the vines with another great wine book. Remember, our show notes, including full details of all the books we've discussed today, are available at italianwinepodcast.com or wherever you get your pods.